This is Jason Henley, Principal Solutions Consultant for TIBCO Software, and thank you for joining me for this TIBCO brief. Today we're going to talk about deploying Flogo applications as Lambda functions, and then exposing those Lambda functions as APIs using both TIBCO Cloud Integration as well as the AWS API Gateway. So we'll start here by looking at the Flogo applications. So I have two different Flogo applications I'm going to talk about today. They're both very simple hello world. The first one we're going to talk about here, and I've already built these, so I'm not going to go through how to build them, but I've got a very simple Lambda trigger. In that Lambda trigger, I've mapped my input event into my input event object that I've defined in my input flow. I've also created a name parameter. And so what I'm doing here is I'm passing in the entire event, and that just kind of helps me do some logging and debugging inside my application. And then I'm extracting an actual named item from that event so that I can operate on that throughout this. So the basic functionality here is pass me a name and I will tell you hello. All right. So, and of course my output is very simple. I'm just mapping this data flow output object into my trigger response back to Lambda. Okay, so in my input output is where you'll see here that I've got my event and my name parameters, and my output has my data defined as an object because I'm going to be returning a JSON string. First thing I do is just create a very simple log message, and what I really want to do here is I want to see my event. Again, this allows me to sort of see what's coming in, so if I have any issues accessing anything, I know exactly what was passed to me, and that helps me figure those things out. Next, I've got this JSON to data activity. This allows me to generate a JSON string and then generate an actual JSON data object. So you can see here, I'm just doing a very simple concatenation, just stringing a few of those together, creating a basic JSON structure with just a data element saying hello, and then whatever name you pass me, again, accessing that name flow parameter. And then the final step is just to reply. And it's very simple. I'm going to do nothing more than pass the data object that comes out of that JSON to data activity back to my data output, and that's what gets returned by my Lambda function. So if you've never worked with Flogo before, there are some other videos that talk about how to build Flogo applications and deploy them, but the very simple way is to go to your build here, the build option here, do the serverless app. That'll generate a zip file for you, which you can then come out here to the Lambda management console, and you can upload that file. All right, so I've already created that one. So let's look at, and there's the function that I'm going to be working with right here. So I've already got that uploaded. I've got a test event. So if you want to look at what this test event is doing, it's just simply passing in name is Jason. So I'm going to run that test, and you'll see I get a successful response of a JSON string with data hello Jason, right? So quick and easy. You can see down here, this does show me my map here, but in my Flogo activity, I actually show what that evaluates to. So this is actually what's getting passed to me. So that's nice to be able to see and know what I'm working with. Okay. Now the next piece I'm going to do is actually expose this API expose this function as an API. And I can do that with a TIBCO Cloud Integration application. So I've got a Lambda test application built here. Now this is a Flogo based application, and I've got multiple flows that I'm going to be talking about throughout this, but the one I'm going to be showing right now is this expose Lambda as API. So within this API, now again, this is just Flogo, but Flogo in the TIBCO Cloud Integration. And so I start with a very simple trigger, which is my HTTP trigger, very simple path. But the key is here, and I go into my invoke Lambda function. So this is a basic activity that's delivered within TIBCO Cloud Integration. I've got this J Henley AWS connection that I've pre-configured. And if you want to see what that looks like, we'll come up here. You can see I've already configured this connector. And this is basically allowing me to put in my access ID and my secret. I'm assuming a role here. I've got a shared role that gives me access to Lambda and the other things that I want to look at. So this is what I'm actually using to authenticate into AWS and assume another role. Okay, so if I go back to my app here and my Lambda test and my expose Lambda as API. So all I'm basically doing is telling it, look, I want to connect to AWS, and here is the ARN of the function that I actually want to create. And that's easy to find. you can just go get it right here and hit this quick little easy copy thing and paste that into TIBCO Cloud Integration. I've told it my payload schema, right? So this is what my function is expecting. And remember, we saw that when we were over here. You see this is my input right there, right? So I'm just basically just taking that and I can paste it right into that. For my input, what I've actually done over here on my flow inputs is I've created a query parameter just called name. So on the API that's being exposed from TIBCO Cloud Integration, I've just got a very simple name parameter that I'm going to map and pass into, come back to here, map and pass that into this payload, and I'm just going to have it be the query parameter name. So now that structure that I created here, this value right here is going to get replaced by whatever query parameter that I pass in. Okay? And that's really it. It's going to send that event to the Lambda function, and it's going to do exactly what we saw it do over here, and it's going to tell me, hello, whoever, right? I do some simple logs just to tell me what's going on. I configure my HTTP response. So again, if you come back over here and look, I've got my my output settings. So I've got just a single 200 defined, very simple. And you can see here I've done response is string as opposed to data. This is saying data is that. And really the simplicity here is just to show you that I can take data that's coming back from that function and then I can expose it however I want. In this case, I'm just changing the field from data to response, but that you can see how you could completely change the entire structure if you wanted to do that. So come back over here to my configure HTTP response. This is what it's actually going back as response. So I just simply map my invoke right here, which was my data, pass that in, and then I'll return my entire response body back to that. All right, so very, very simple. So what I can do is I can come back out here. All right, so we'll just come into my test function here. So here's my Lambda test. So I'm just gonna say, my name is YouTube, and we're gonna execute that Lambda function, and we're gonna say, hello, YouTube. So very, very basic, but again, we got a Lambda function, a nice generic Lambda function, and we can expose that as an API. From this application, I think it's clear to see that I could then take this flow and I could do a lot of other stuff. I can invoke that Lambda function, I can invoke other APIs, I can call a database. You typically don't want these to be overly complex, but you could have some additional flows and then you can return that. So you can invoke actually multiple Lambda functions as well, and you could string those and orchestrate those together into a nice forward-facing API. Okay, now the second example that I want to talk about is a similar example, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the AWS API Gateway to expose my API as opposed to using TIBCO Cloud Integration to expose my API. Now to do that, I'm going to use a slightly different Lambda function that I've built, which is a slightly different Flogo application. And the reason I'm doing that is really simple. And it's something that I want everyone to be aware of when you're building Lambda functions, whether they're in Flogo or any other language, is that if you're going to expose your Lambda function as an API through the AWS API Gateway, everything gets strung together automatically for you. So you need to be aware of that ahead of time so that you know how to access the variables that are coming in. So for all intents and purposes, this flow is exactly the same. I have a Lambda function. I've got my event trigger. Let me go to my inputs and outputs. You see I've created event, I've created name, everything is the same. And when I map my input in, you see here, I just bring in my entire event, but this is where the difference is. Notice here, I have to do event.queryStringParameters.name because this Lambda function, this Flogo app that's gonna be a Lambda function, needs to understand that it's being called by an AWS API Gateway API, which is going to pass the variables in via a map structure called queryStringParameters. Right? If I tried to expose my my other Flogo app as AWS API Gateway API, I would have a very difficult time, if not an impossible time. In fact, I spent quite a bit of time trying to do it, actually doing that, because there's no way for me to simply pass something called name into the map event. And I'll show that a little bit when I show some of the CloudWatch logs and show what's actually getting passed in. Okay, so if we come over here now, you see the rest of this. The rest of this is exactly the same. I'm doing everything the same. When I come in here, you see I'm still now just building and concatenating my function, because regardless, I've pulled out what I needed to pull out from the event into the name flow variable. So now I can just access that flow. So the big difference really was in that mapping from the Lambda function right here, right? And that's what you have to be aware of when you're building this. So I take this, you follow the same process of exporting it. Now I've got it configured here, and then you simply just go down here and hit add trigger, and then it just automatically creates that API for you, right? So I can go from this API. Let me go ahead and click on that. Let's jump over to this API. So here's my API gateway, here's my API, and here's my method. So I can go ahead and test it from right here. Now, I didn't go so far as to try to configure this API and make it nice, but I've got all the methods, so I'm just gonna choose a get because that's what it is. We'll do a name equals, we'll call this AWS, and I'll hit test, right? And so you can see that comes back as hello AWS, right? But the key thing that I want to show you, if you come over here and you look at these CloudWatch groups, in fact, let me jump right here and let's look at my monitoring. And you look at these recent invocations, right? So when we come down here, you look at my latest invocation. So here's the event that was sent to me. So you can see this map structure is quite complex. It's got a lot of stuff inside of it. And if you look in here long enough, what we will find is this guy right here. You see this query string parameter, which is a map which contains name and TIBCO. Now, if you compare that to my other invocation, you see here, I've got an event that came in simply as map name JSON, right? Again, compare that with this map resource query string parameters, then a map name TIBCO, right? So it's a much more complex structure, and you have to be aware that you need to dig into this query string parameter in order to get what you need. And likewise, you can see here from my log within Flogo, you can see it now as that map has been converted into this JSON structure, and you can see clearly that there's a query string parameters entity that I need to go through, and that's why I had to have that query string parameter in my Flogo application. So again, you have to know that you're going to expose it as an API when you're building the Lambda function. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble accessing the variables that you needed. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to show is, yes, I can deploy this as a AWS API Gateway API, but that doesn't mean I can't still consume it in my TIBCO Cloud Integration. So if I back up a little bit, first of all, I can take that same function, the same function that the AWS API Gateway was exposing, I can expose, or I can consume it rather in TIBCO Cloud Integration, expose it just as easily as I did before. So again, I've got this invoke Lambda function. Everything else here I've got set up is the same. I've got a name parameter coming in, and in this invoke Lambda function, my input settings, all I did, because I know, remember, my Flogo app thinks now that things are coming from something called query string parameters. So all I said was, okay, I can deal with that. I'll pass you a payload schema that matches that. I'm only going to represent the query string parameter structure because that's all my Flogo app needs, right? So I just define my payload schema as this instead of just the name string like I had before, right? But at this point now, it's nothing more than a mapping exercise, and in name, I pass my query param and I can send that through. So again, exposing it through the AWS API Gateway or exposing it through TIBCO Cloud Integration, both can be done. But if you're gonna expose it through the AWS API Gateway, you better know ahead of time when you build that Flogo app, or any Lambda function, by the way, that you are gonna be accessing query string parameters or path parameters or whatever method you're going to be using to pass in parameters. Right, so we'll just go ahead and execute this and say AWS Gateway, try it out, and there you go. Okay, now the last scenario I want to talk about is the scenario in which you do go ahead and expose your Lambda function as an AWS API Gateway, but now you still want to be able to consume that API and maybe orchestrate it into some other thing. So one last simple test is to not call the Lambda function itself, but actually call the API that's exposed by the AWS API Gateway. So again, I've got the exact same front end, a name parameter that's coming in, but instead of executing the Lambda function, I'm just calling a REST service. So at this point, I don't know that it's a Lambda function. All I know is that it's an API. So I've got my input settings here, which again, I've created a name parameter, which I'm going to pass it, because remember, my AWS API Gateway right here wanted this query string of name equals something. So I'm mimicking that here. And then when I do my input, I'm simply going to pass in name to be the query parameter that I pass to my API. So this example is a little bit of a no-op. I've got an API that's basically exposing the same API. But again, the point here is that you could expose a more complete API that called this RESTful service as well as 2 or 3 others and orchestrated those together. So whether you want to execute the Lambda function directly or whether you want to invoke the API from the AWS API Gateway, you can do both of those in the TIBCO Cloud Integration. And that gives you a little bit more of a robust integration environment that you can have options on how you want to expose these things. And of course, all of these APIs can then be managed by pushing them into the Mastery API management platform. Again, Mastery and the AWS API Gateway can live harmoniously. Okay, you can generate APIs in the AWS API Gateway and then manage those APIs through Mastery.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope you found these few minutes useful, and if so, please like and subscribe. If you have any suggestions for additional topics, you can leave them in the comments section. And don't forget to visit tibco.com as well as our TIBCO community at community.tibco.com. You can find the project shown in this video as well as others in our GitHub repository, which is linked below. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly. My contact info is in the description.